When modern assumptions saturate our reading of ancient texts, they completely obscure the original historical meaning from the modern reader. This split-screen layout highlights a stark textual contradiction. On the left, Proverbs 21 explicitly warns that wine is a mocker and a brawler. On the right, Psalm 104:15 praises wine as a divine blessing meant to gladden the human heart. The original manuscripts do not use different terms for the poison and the blessing. They use the identical Hebrew root word, yayin. Modern theology attempts to resolve this tension using a logical equation known as the moderationist syllogism. The entire argument rests on this first premise, the assumption that the biblical term refers exclusively to fermented, intoxicating alcohol. If the liquid is always alcoholic, interpreters are forced to conclude that the biblical warnings target the volume consumed rather than the substance itself. Yet the text never defines a safe limit or a permissible volume. Throughout the 20th century, prominent evangelical organizations abandoned strict textual rules requiring abstinence. Moderation became the accepted standard. Leaders like Billy Graham publicly asserted that the text does not teach teetotalism. Teetotalism is the practice of total abstinence from alcoholic beverages. Graham cited the belief that Jesus himself drank fermented wine. This theological stance directly shaped social policy, providing the justification for serving alcohol at the highest levels of government, including the Carter White House. The church shifted its framework. Instead of treating abstinence as a moral mandate derived from the text, a concept known as biblical ethics, alcoholism was redefined strictly through biological ethics. It became a medical disease to be managed rather than a behavioral violation. This entire consensus rests on a lexicographical error. It applies a restricted modern dictionary definition backward onto an ancient vocabulary. Current dictionaries define wine exclusively as the fermented juice of grapes. This locks the modern reader into a rigid assumption. Looking at this timeline of English dictionaries, we see that exclusivity vanish as we move backward. The 1828 Webster's Dictionary defines the term must, which is freshly crushed fruit juice containing skins and seeds, as new wine pressed from the grape but not fermented. Going back further to John Kersey's 1708 dictionary, the definition explicitly categorizes unfermented grape juice as a type of wine. When the King James Version of the Bible was translated between 1604 and 1611, the English word wine served as a generic umbrella term encompassing both fermented and unfermented grape juice. The one wine theory is an accident of modern linguistics. We have overwritten a historical dual-purpose noun with a narrowed modern definition. To understand the original manuscripts, we must trace the root words back into classical antiquity. This linguistic tree diagram illustrates the etymology. The modern English term descends directly from the Koine Greek word oinos, passing through the Latin vinum. Koine Greek is the common dialect used throughout the post-classical Mediterranean world. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded the terminology of his era. The Romans used vinum to describe highly intoxicating drinks, but they also applied it to vinum dulce, sweet unfermented must, and boiled grape syrups like sapa and defrutum. The Greeks shared this taxonomy. In his work Meteorologica, Aristotle categorizes unfermented grape juice, which he calls glucose, as a recognized form of oinos. Classical writers like Athenaeus prescribed this specific unfermented sweet wine for stomach ailments, precisely because it lacked the potency to intoxicate. Secular classical culture possessed both the vocabulary and the agricultural technology to preserve grape juice without fermentation. They recognized it as a distinct, valid subcategory of wine. This dual-meaning structure is anchored securely in the foundational language of the Old Testament, Hebrew, and the specific usage of the word yain. Ancient Jewish culture meticulously recorded the variations of the grape harvest. The Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin 70a outlines these distinct states. It defines the phrase yain migat, which literally translates to wine from the press. This refers to the freshly pressed, entirely unfermented juice of the grape, explicitly identifying it as yain. This diagram connects the cross-lingual translations. When ancient scholars created the Septuagint, the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, they confirmed this overlap. They repeatedly translated tirosh, the specific Hebrew word for fresh grape juice, directly into the Greek word for wine, oinos. Across 4 languages and thousands of years of agricultural history, the terminology maintained a dual meaning. The premise that ancient wine was always alcoholic is factually incorrect. We can now resolve the textual contradiction, how the same liquid can be called both a venomous mocker and a divine blessing. Returning to our split-screen text, we apply the historical lexicon. Proverbs condemns fermented yayin, while the Psalm praises the fresh, unfermented yield. The moderationist equation collapses. Its first premise is replaced by historical reality. The ancient world recognized two distinct types of wine. The biblical metric for approval or condemnation is the actual nature of the substance itself, not a subjective limit on the quantity consumed. The text does not contradict itself, nor does it require modern readers to impose arbitrary volume limits onto ancient verses. It distinguishes cleanly between a toxic narcotic and a nourishing harvest. The early temperance movements were not driven by the modern concept of biological ethics. They were mobilized by strict textual conviction. Reading the text through its original vocabulary gave early advocates the moral certainty required to drive massive social and legal restructuring, culminating in nationwide prohibition. Treating alcohol abuse strictly as a biological disease creates a no-fault framework. It absolves the individual, the manufacturer, and the culture of moral responsibility by ignoring the original textual warnings against the substance itself. Rigorous scholarship demands we read ancient texts through ancient vocabularies. When we do, we ensure our ethical frameworks are derived from the original manuscript, rather than an accident of a modern dictionary.